Welcome to the Cambridge Tech Podcast, talking all things technology from the heart of the UK's tech capital. Here are your hosts, Faye Holland and James Parton.
I'm Faye.
And I'm James. So how was last week for you, Faye?
Last week, I was a PR machine. We had 3 new client projects on the go, all really different. And it's slightly exacerbated because stories have to land at certain times. But we've got the budget coming up. We've got the US elections. We've got COP coming up. So it's a massive juggling game. But it keeps us on our toes. So that's fun. I also met with Kristin Ann Rutter at Cambridge University Health Partners about supporting entrepreneurship coming out of there. So I think there's going to be some really interesting things that we can bring onto the podcast too.
Nice.
What about you?
Yeah, not as glamorous as that.
Quite right too.
I caught actually, do you remember, listeners hopefully will remember, we spoke to Tamsin from Where You At in episode 99. Yeah. So I had a good catch up with Tamsin this week. They're developing some new sensors that will allow you to do passive data collection rather than having to download the app. So we're kind of in an early conversation about what we might do at the Bradfield Centre with that technology. So that's kind of interesting. That's
great. And actually thinking about the Bradfield Centre, that reminds me, once we've finished recording the news, I need to talk to you about something else that you might want to trial at the Bradfield Centre, knowing how innovative you are.
Okay.
Could you commit to that right now?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Not last week, but I also went to Freshers' Fair the week before last. So that was really interesting. Got to hang out with Caroline and Helen and the team and Georgie. So that was good on the OE Cambridge stand. Yeah, that was about it really. Lots of strategy stuff this week as well. So
you love a bit of strategy.
Yeah, can't share that. Top secret stuff.
Oh, exciting. I shall wait for news on that then. So let's move on to last week's tech news, shall we? Cambridge life science company Nuclera closed a $75 million Series C round led by American backer Elevage Medical Technologies, which will fuel international expansion, especially into the US. Nuclera's e-protein discovery system is designed to speed up protein expression and purification in research labs, including those using AI for protein design.
CMR Surgical has won FDA approval for gallbladder removal using its Versius surgery robot in the US market. Gallbladder removal is one of the most common operating procedures performed in hospitals in the US, and CMR Surgical is confident this will just be the start. Globally, Versius is the second most used surgical robot system with over 26,000 surgical procedures completed.
Last week saw a record-breaking international investment summit which secured £63 billion worth of investment and nearly 38,000 jobs for the UK. Of particular interest to tech was news that 4 US firms have announced a combined £6.3 billion investment into UK data centres. These were CyrusOne, ServiceNow, Cloud HQ and CoreWeave. The UK will now be the home for their data infrastructure, with some of the new data centres set to be complete as soon as 2028. So this is really great news, and it's also really consistent with UK investment that we've seen with companies like KO Data, who are building another data centre up in Manchester. Also announced last week was news that Poppy Gustafson will lead the UK's Office for Investment. Poppy is the recently departed CEO of Cambridge cybersecurity company Darktrace, following its sale to Thoma Bravo of $5.3 billion.
And Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, "I'm delighted to welcome Poppy as our new investment minister. She's an accomplished entrepreneur who brings invaluable experience to the role. We're upgrading the Office of Investment to ensure it's fit for purpose and has the capacity it needs to make the UK the first choice for investment and the best place in the world to do business, which is central to our mission to drive growth and to make people better off."
Moving on to today's episode, we're delighted to be joined by co-founder and Managing Director of FLIT, Alex Murray.
Hi, Alex. It's great to have you on the podcast with us today.
Hello, good to be here.
So you are one of only two of our guests who have experienced Faye falling off her chair. How was that for you?
It's quite early in the morning, so it kept things lively. It's good.
Oh my goodness. Right, swiftly moving on. Alex, tell us about yourself. Tell us about your starter journey and how FLIT Bikes came about.
Yeah, so to start the company off, there were 2 of us, 2 co-founders, and it's a pretty typical story of serendipity, I think. My background was in management consulting originally, but I didn't really like working on other people's projects, I guess. So I had an opportunity to go and do a master's degree in Beijing at Tsinghua University, where I was doing a master's in public policy, but also learning a bit of Mandarin. And I was also very into cycling. So to get to Beijing, I actually flew down to Hong Kong with my bike and cycled up from Hong Kong to Beijing to start the new academic year. While I was there, I was also sort of looking for projects to work on, I guess. And I met a young engineer who was doing an automotive engineering degree, young British engineer who'd gone over there, who was very interested in electric vehicles. So we met, our academic coursework required us to do a couple of projects, started working on projects together, and eventually we homed in on the electric bike market. Electric bikes are all over the place in China. I think there's sort of over 30 million sold a year, but they're a very different beast to what we see over here. So we saw that they were growing very, very quickly in Europe, looked at the market, narrowed it down, and noticed that folding e-bikes had been somewhat neglected. Even though they're one of the most practical things you can use, most of the bikes were essentially folding bikes that had been retrofitted to be electric, and we thought we could do something better. So we decided to set up a company and start tackling that problem. And we looked around where we should bring it back to. We're both British, so we thought we'd head back to the UK, and we identified Cambridge as the best place to go.
You know what I find quite interesting about your and Dave's stories? You both came from different angles. So Dave from the engineering perspective, and you very much from policy and making happier and healthier places for us to be. But you know, there was serendipity in that relationship as well, of you both bringing different things to the party.
Yeah, I think it's almost sort of a textbook founding story in that you have a technical founder and a commercial founder, which works well in some situations. I think some founding groups like Entrepreneur First now pushing more into the tech co-founders. Depends on the area you're targeting. So we target slightly more, we deal a lot more with customers, directly with end consumers, and a lot more with distributors, retailers, that kind of thing. So I think having a bit of commercial experience in there is quite useful.
You cycled from Hong Kong to Beijing. Did you cycle from Beijing to Cambridge?
No, I haven't done that one yet. Okay. Sadly, some of the places in between are no longer safe to do it, but maybe one day.
Indeed. Okay.
So I think it's really interesting, if I'm understanding correctly, the decision to come to Cambridge was purely based on it being a cycling hotspot in the UK. Was the UK one of the choices because of the kind of business environment and the ease of maybe starting a company and potentially finding backers? Was that the decision to come here?
Certainly part of it. I mean, this was just before, actually, I think the Brexit vote had already happened, right, but hadn't been fully implemented yet. So as in this is before 2020. There are a few European places if you want to do this kind of thing. So mobility startups, Germany has a lot going on around Berlin, Munich, etc. The Netherlands has quite a lot going on. Yeah. But we knew that as non-EU citizens, it'd be a bit harder for us to sort of get established there. Okay. So we were looking at the UK, a few places in the UK. Obviously, if you're doing a startup, London is it's a big market, which is quite useful. But Cambridge is quite unique in many ways. But it has the highest cycling rate in the UK, so about 40%, I think, of commutes in Cambridge are done by bicycle. It has a fantastic engineering pedigree, so for hiring engineers to join the company, and also just a great startup ecosystem. So whether that's investors or other advisors, accountants, specialist accountants, IP, attorneys, and so on. So it really had the full mix of what we were looking to get started.
Yeah, interesting. So let's talk about the market then. I mean, you touched on the 30 million electric bikes in China. What does the market opportunity look like for you in the UK and Europe? And you've obviously honed in on this kind of particular slice of the market, which is the foldable bike. So talk us through how you've kind of built up that business plan and what that kind of projection looks like and the opportunity.
Yeah, so globally, it's a bit complicated because essentially we say e-bike, but e-bike means a very different thing in different places. Right. So the Chinese market, for example, it's largely not relevant to what we do because what is classed as an e-bike in China under that regulatory regime is very different here. Again, the US is not that relevant because they actually regulate it state by state, which makes it very difficult to design and sell e-bikes. So for example, in Alabama, anything, I think this is still the rule, anything with two wheels and a motor, an electric motor, or a motor of any description is a motorcycle. Right. And you have to follow all motorcycle restrictions. Whereas in California, you can largely do what you want, as far as I can tell. The European Union, there's a lot of debate internationally about the European Union's place, but it's certainly a regulatory superpower, and it set the regulations around e-bikes fairly early and comprehensively. Those regulations were set before Brexit, so we've copied them in the UK into our statute books. And internationally, a lot of countries, smaller countries like Australia, I think follows very similar regulations, Singapore, Israel, where they don't want to develop a whole regulatory regime themselves and perhaps have small markets. They copy and paste the regulations essentially with a few adjustments, which means if you design for the European Union market, you can essentially sell in lots of different places around the world. So we followed that framework. The UK and the EU are still effectively harmonized in that sense. So our initial jumping off point is Europe. Since the Brexit transition, so specifically since December 2020, it's quite hard to ship across borders. Particularly something like e-bikes have lithium-ion battery in them, which is considered a dangerous good. So to get that across the border, even though there isn't a hard border, there's just a lot of paperwork. It's very expensive. Initially, we started sales just in the UK, but the European Union is our main growth market. That's because the UK is actually a bit behind on this. The European e-bike market is about 5.5 million units. So 5.5 million e-bikes per year. Of that, the UK makes up about 150,000.
Wow. Okay.
Germany alone makes up 2 million.
Right.
So the adoption of e-bikes in the UK, despite everyone constantly telling me they're seeing more and more of them every day, we're actually way behind the curve. In markets like Germany and the Netherlands, 50% of all new bicycles sold are e-bikes. In the UK, it's closer to 10%.
Have you got the insight into why that might be? Why are we lagging behind so badly?
This is much debated, and I don't think anyone's sort of really got the numbers to back this up properly, but there's some debate that the UK is a bit more sport-orientated. So if you say cycling to a typical Brit, they'll think of the Olympics, they'll think of Chris Hoy, think of these kind of celebrity gold-winning cyclists, or the Tour de France. If you say cycling to someone in the Netherlands, they'll say, yeah, that's how I sort of get to the shops. It's just a practical tool. And once you're cycling as a practical tool, having an electric assist it helps you do the job better, essentially. So I'm often told in the UK that having an e-bike is cheating. I've never heard that in the Netherlands.
Right. So it's transportation versus fitness kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So in previous roles, I've kind of been on the edge of discussions around the future of mobility. For example, car ownership in the future, probably people moving away from owning cars and, using community car rental schemes and things like that. How does, cycling and alternative transport modes come together in like the future vision maybe of the government for a mobility strategy?
People are looking at this from all sorts of ways and quite interesting ways as well. So from the government's point of view, they essentially want more people cycling, and I guess how they do it, they don't really care. They just want more people cycling because essentially it's largely the health benefits and the returns to the NHS are quite high, to the point where there are some experiments where doctors are prescribing cycling as a treatment or as a preventative measure. The government's certainly very interested in that, has a number of strategy documents, but they don't really get into the weeds of it too much. It all largely gets passed down. Larger, what we might call mobility companies, like car companies, are adopting what they call mobility strategies. So they are increasingly realizing or accepting that the car in, say, central London is not going to be the ideal tool for everyone. So they're trying to do collaborations to get more people or to get involved in other modes of transport. But the most effective way it's happening essentially is through incentives. So in the UK, we have the Cycle to Work scheme, which gives a significant discount if you buy a bike. It's a salary sacrifice scheme. That's been around for a long time. It hasn't changed too much. The main change is a few years ago, they reduced the cap. So it was a £1,000 cap. And they got rid of that cap largely because e-bikes are coming in and they're a slightly higher priced product, and therefore they wanted people to be able to do that. Also, some of the bikes that start to look a bit less like bikes, so a lot of cargo bikes. I'm sure around Cambridge, a lot of people see kids being taken to school in cargo bikes. Some of those electric cargo bikes can be, £5,000, £6,000, £7,000, some of the higher end ones. But it takes a car off the road, it gets people cycling, it's pretty good for health and other outcomes as well. So the Cycle to Work scheme has been around for a long time, has been adjusted to allow e-bikes. But again, in the UK, we are slightly behind the curve. I should be clear as well. So the UK market's quite small, but it's growing quite quickly, or has been growing quickly. And the assumption is that we will actually reach that same 50% level as other countries. We're just behind the curve. But because other countries are further along that curve, they're being a bit more innovative. So in Germany, for example, again, Germany's just the largest market in Europe. So I talk about that quite a lot. In Germany, they have a sort of version of the Cycle to Work scheme, but it's essentially a leasing scheme that gets people new products on a sort of a 3-year cycle. That's now about half of all the e-bikes sold in Germany are now done through leases. It's relatively early stages, but it's growing very, very fast. And again, it's similar in all European countries. They're largely incentivizing this for public policy reasons, pretty sound public policy reasons.
And I guess that you've seen that with cities deploying, the cycle hubs around different cities where you can just hop on and off a bike to get yourself around cities and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And all the whole theme of shared mobility as well. So whether that's the dockless or the docked schemes, that whole market's kind of shaken out. That's good for some things. It's not good for all things. So there was a lot of people were saying it was going to take over the world a few years ago. Turns out it's mostly used for sort of incidental journeys. So it's very popular with tourists, for example. Or if you nip into London for the day, you might jump on a Voi or a Lime bike or whatever it happens to be. But for commuters, still people like to own their own bike.
So, Alex, let's talk a little bit about what you're actually doing as a founder of the company. So we're going to go on and talk about the bike specifically in a moment, but what you're doing is obviously quite different to many of the other guests that we get on the podcast. So I guess what I'm interested in is, how do you approach developing this kind of product? What do you think as a founder are the key drivers that you're looking for?
In the early stages, it's not actually too different in the sense that there's quite a lot of hardcore engineering that goes into developing the product during the R&D phase. We are a bit different, I guess, in that we talk a lot to the riders of the bike, so talk a lot to just regular customers, regular members of the public, unlike a lot of hard tech startups in Cambridge that are, developing things for large industries and more B2B focused. There's a little bit of difference, I guess, in the sort of value proposition in terms of who you're talking to. But the development process itself is pretty similar in many ways. So we have patents that cover the bike, registered designs, etc. And also, not only do we have that intellectual property that covers essentially how the bike works, how it folds, but we've also developed our own manufacturing method that is pretty unique in the industry. So there's a specific reason for that. We try not to do anything frivolously, but the way the bike folds, to get it nice and compact, you need to reduce the tolerances in the bike essentially. And most bikes of this type are welded together, which introduces distortions in the frame itself, but we actually use adhesive bonding. So this is like a really, 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 really strong glue. It's used pretty commonly in the aerospace and automotive industries. And by bonding the bike together, there's no distortion in that process. So we can get it much more compact. So we've had to develop not only the fold, but also the manufacturing process that allows that fold to be as tight as it is. And that's all kind of behind the scenes. We like to say that we do all that work behind the scenes. The customer never really sees it. They just get a product that's easy to use, but you still have to do that hard work. So in terms of the Cambridge ecosystem, yes, I guess we're quite different in terms of the sector we sit in and how we face out to the public. But behind the scenes, our engineers are talking to lots of other engineers, whether it be from the Institute for Welding or the Institute for Manufacturing. Lots of organizations around Cambridge, we engage with them on a technical level.
So that process and that design, I guess that's the heart of your kind of IP strategy then, is it? That's the patented kind of processes that gives you your unique selling point, essentially.
Yeah, essentially. So there are a few main criteria that people are looking for when they're buying an e-bike. Like I said, it's a practical tool. So there are just some very practical things you have to do well. You want it to be light, you want it to be compact. For a folding e-bike, the main criteria, as far as I'm concerned, is does it fit in a train luggage rack?
Yeah.
You'll get some amazing folding e-bikes that are very light, for example, but they're not very compact, so they're not actually very practical, even though they'll look cool in a sort of design magazine. But then because we're talking to end customers who are riding this to work, you do also have to think a bit more about the aesthetics, how the product looks, how it makes them feel, all those kinds of things. So yeah, it's a slightly different consideration to selling, a tool to a large pharmaceutical company.
So that was an interesting point you just made earlier on as well about Germany doing leases. And so looking at different models of ownership. So what are you thinking with regards to the bike for you?
Sure. So once you change the ownership model, you solve a bunch of questions or problems, and you sort of introduce some new ones. So one of the big themes that ties into, which again is a sort of strategic theme for a lot of governments around Europe, is circular economy. So you have all these products being used in a lease. What happens to them at the end of the lease? And ideally, they're refurbished and reintroduced to the market in some way. So we're currently doing a grant through the Advanced Propulsion Center. It's called the TDAP grant. That is exploring this theme of end-of-lease products and how they can be best reused. So we're looking at a few things. Within that, we're looking at how the bicycle itself can be refurbished efficiently. We're looking at how the batteries can be refurbished, both in electric cars and electric bikes. End-of-life batteries is a major question. It's quite hard to recycle them at the minute. And the final theme is, if we're going to do that, if we're going to refurbish these bikes and put them onto a second-hand market, how do we actually get them back efficiently? So it's looking at the operations and logistics piece.
Well, let's move on and talk about the product. We're sitting here looking actually at one of your bikes, just folding up to the side here. Tell us about the history and the kind of the development and the iterations you've been through to get to the products, and how many models do you have? Is it the single model right now, or is there a range of different options?
Yeah, sure. So we went through quite a lot of prototyping. We still have them in the roof space of our workshop, and occasionally we'll get them out and just remember how foolish we were in the early days. There's one box that no one's allowed to see inside because it's embarrassing, to be honest. Yeah, so we went through lots of iterations. I like a lot of mechanical prototyping. You want to start with some sort of low fidelity prototypes and then get your hands on something as quickly as possible to discover what the parameters are. Start talking to people as well, because the worst thing you can do, I think, is probably lock yourself in a workshop, design something for 3 years, and then show it to members of the public and realize you've designed the wrong thing. So it's very, very iterative, and we use a lot of rapid prototyping techniques around sort of 3D printing. That's, everyone's using 3D printing now, but also developing relationships. This is probably more important, actually, developing relationships with our suppliers so that they can prototype for us in the actual materials we're going to be using as quickly as possible. So we've done a lot of work on that, and we actually help other startups in the mechanical space, should we say, who need to make physical prototypes to do that. I think that's become one of our sort of areas of expertise. So we, played around initially, eventually settled on a fold that was unique. Now, folding bikes have been around for over 100 years. So if you want to come up with a patent on a folding bike, it's pretty difficult. There have been a lot of people in a lot of garden sheds who have made a lot of folding bikes. So it's hard to find something unique. What is unique is, or what gave us an in, is that lithium-ion batteries are relatively new, have been growing in popularity, and have only really been used in e-bikes relatively recently. So one of the main insights is, okay, if you're going to build this into the frame and have a more integrated product, so all the electronics are in the frame, then how would you fold it? And that's a slightly different question, and that's what we've come up with. So all the electronics are housed in the oversized top tube of the bike, and then the bike folds around that in a unique way. That patent was filed years ago, has gone through the whole process, has been granted across Europe. So that's pretty secure. And that does give us a unique fold. And then combined with the manufacturing method, which is more on the sort of know-how side of IP, I guess, just a lot of stuff in our engineers' brains, essentially, it allows us to make the product in the way we do. That's what makes it unique. And then on top of that, that's sort of the core product. But there are lots of things, little things around it that you pick up over the years. So, for example, even though it's light for an e-bike, it's about 14 kilos, and typically e-bikes are more like 20. You don't want to carry it all the time, so we've designed it to be very easy to roll around when it's folded. And those are some of the little details that actually can take quite a lot of effort, but then once you crack it, it delivers a unique advantage to the customer. So we look out for this whenever we're at shows, just talking to people in general. Anything where people have a reaction to it and go, oh, wow, that's really cool, we'll sort of home in on those things and really double down.
Yeah, I mean, as you came in today, you were kind of using the saddle as a kind of steering it as you were pushing it along the ground. Very simple.
And this is the thing, this is what I said earlier, that it should look simple.
Yeah.
So anyone seeing it, exactly.
Yeah.
To get that right actually took a long time.
Yeah. And do you manufacture yourselves, or do you outsource to a manufacturer? Is that in the UK? Is that overseas?
So this has been one of the big themes as well. So and again, there's a bit of history to this. So originally we were manufacturing in Taiwan. Taiwan has a very, very good history in the bike industry. A lot of high quality products come out of Taiwan, especially with aluminium frames, welding, etc. So we were manufacturing there. Manufactured our first batch of bikes. So our original model was called the FLIT 16, and the new model is called the FLIT M2. It's sort of an evolution, if you will, of the original bike. The FLIT 16 was made in Taiwan, but we made the first batch and we finished it up in the summer of 2020. So we were sort of halfway through manufacturing it when COVID started, which is a very interesting problem to have, because we had a sort of scaling plan at that point. But the time to weld a bike frame, the lead time went from 3 months to about a year and a half, just to weld the frame. because there was such a huge boom in demand for cycling. So as a young startup and as a relatively small company, you are suddenly competing for factory space with all of the big guys. And we were put down firmly to the bottom of the list, shall we say. We didn't have the supplier relationships. We didn't have, the cash to throw at the problem, et cetera, et cetera. So that's when we got a grant from Innovate UK to develop the new manufacturing method and sort of started working through that problem. And a part of that has been reshoring. So we brought a lot of the manufacturing back to the UK as part of that. It's largely because the manufacturing method is quite unique. As I said earlier, there's a lot of know-how in it. So being able to do it ourselves has just meant we can keep learning, improving, and getting it right as well. So currently, a lot of the individual parts of the bike are made all over the world, but then they all come into Cambridge and we actually make the frames here. So we bond up the frames here, just up the road. And we're only about a kilometre away from where we're doing this podcast. And then we assemble the bikes here as well and then ship them out directly.
Right, okay. And in terms of I guess, for want of a better expression, the use case, is the E part of the e-bike, is it constant use of the electric for propulsion? Is it, inclines and that kind of stuff? What's the typical use case and what kind of, time do you have on the battery before recharging and all that kind of stuff? What speed does it achieve, that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. So there's quite a few things that are just governed by the regulations, which sort of it gives you a box to paint in, I guess. So in terms of the speed, the battery has to cut out at about 15 miles an hour.
Okay.
So 25 kilometers an hour. That's true for all e-bikes. And if you see one going significantly faster than that, it's either got a very fit cyclist on it or it's highly illegal. So yeah, the speed is governed, the size of the motor is governed, but then we have some choices elsewhere. So e-bikes are, the best way to think about them is essentially you're just cycling like normal, but you're just feeling really fit that day. It's like you got an Olympic cycle. Yeah, it's assisted, exactly. So it's boosting what you do. One of the interesting things when I started riding e-bikes is I was finding that my journeys across a city like London were faster, but my top speed wasn't faster. It's just because you're quicker at accelerating. So if you're in stop-start traffic, like in London, you're just... it's fantastic when you get to a traffic light and someone in Lycra sort of sneaks in front of you and they don't realize you're on an e-bike.
I didn't realize cyclists in London paid any attention to traffic lights, but there you go.
It does happen. But as soon as they get in front of you, as soon as that light goes green, you'll shoot off the line much faster than they will. So it's quite satisfying. Anyway, so they're used for all sorts of things. It really depends what you're doing. There are a lot of e-mountain bikes, for example, so that's so you can get up the mountain and then cycle down. But if, again, going to this point about like sport versus practical cycling, if you're doing the shopping, if you're picking your kids up for school, if you just want to be able to cycle to the office in a suit and not have to worry about sweating and that sort of thing, they're just very practical tools for doing it. And then the variation within e-bikes, as I said, there's sort of the regulations that cover the broad brushstrokes. You have a few choices about, for example, what kind of sensors you use, where the motor's placed, it all affects the performance. So there's a pretty wide price range, but you largely sort of pay, you get what you pay for.
Yeah.
So, Alex, you've talked a couple of times about different sources of funding and grants, and that's what I'd like to move us on to next. So, you've had a couple of grants and funding from the Department for Transport. You've had an Innovate UK grant. You've talked about the work you're doing on the Technology Developer Accelerator Programme at the Advanced Propulsion Centre. And you've also done a Kickstarter where I believe you raised over 450% of your initial funding goal, which is great. What I would like to know is, a little bit like when we've talked to Farbod Shakura, who's also doing a consumer product, the funding for businesses like yours is actually quite different. So how have you found it, and what has your experience been, and where have you had to go for funding?
Sure. So yeah, it has been quite different, and this is where discussions with other founders in Cambridge sometimes take a bit of a left turn. Because we're doing essentially a product that's going to be used by consumers, we have a few different options. So we have not been a more sort of classic Cambridge story of very, very large grant funding and then supported by investors perhaps for years until you're able to achieve any revenue at all. We achieved revenue relatively early and then have used different iterations of the product to generate that, whilst also taking on grants and investors. And actually, it's been a pretty even split. And that's partly because of the design nature of what we're doing. We always wanted to have a lot of contact with customers from as early as possible. And we're lucky to have been supported in that. The type of grants we often go for are a bit different. So, we're not going for very, very large Innovate UK grants. We've had grants from the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Design Council, as you said, the Advanced Propulsion Centre. So these are a bit more sector focused. There has been enough to get us through the different stages of the journey. It hasn't been a case of taking, one big grant and then working through that for years. It's been a bit more targeted. And those grants are out there if you know where to look, but you do have to look quite carefully. We recently discovered actually that the first ever grant we got, which we were chuffed to bits with, was from the Department for Transport. I was talking to someone from the DFT at an event I went to, and they told us that actually hardly anyone applied for it because it was buried on the DFT website. So it's just the fact that we found it. And that was our first grant. And we were perhaps quite naive. I think we're a bit more sophisticated now. But there's a lot out there if you spend time at the events talking to people and finding out what's on there and digging through government websites.
So without giving your commercial model away, is the plan now to be sustainable by sales of the bike, or are you going to look for, more exponential growth through other investment?
If we wanted to just be profitable and chug along and grow sort of organically, I think we have the option to do that pretty quickly. We're now delivering these bikes. We've got manufacturing set up in Cambridge, and our growth plan would allow us to get to profitability. If we want to be more ambitious and start targeting, for example, these very large markets in Europe, start targeting some of these new ownership models that are growing very, very fast, that requires a bit more investment. That's the current plan. There's a huge opportunity at the minute, the way things are changing. And also, I mentioned earlier how the product's a bit different. I was talking mainly about the performance, but actually one of the interesting things about bringing the manufacturing back to the UK is the manufacturing method we've developed is also cheaper. So there's a significant cost advantage. So we think that the product is very, very competitive, just at a performance level in terms of getting the job done. But we can actually make them pretty efficiently now as well. And we put a lot of effort into that. And that is going to allow us to be scalable. Not only that, but because it's the manufacturing method we developed uses a lot of generalist manufacturing methods, we're not tied to individual bike factories. So in terms of scaling production, we can go talk to lots and lots of partners to do that. And we can actually scale the production very fast. So we know there's a lot of demand in European markets for this kind of product. And we are pretty confident about scaling on the supply side as well. So that's the direction we're heading in.
I'm excited to have you on because we don't often get to talk about marketing. Obviously usually we're talking to deep tech companies and science-based companies, and we very rarely get into the weeds of marketing products. So walk us through what the marketing strategy is and how the kind of budgets that I'm not asking for specific figures, obviously, but as you're raising money and you're bringing money in through revenue, because we don't talk to a lot of consumer facing customers, it's always interesting to understand the kind of the blend of the cost bases you have. So there's a lot in there that I've just kind of rambled through, but let's start with the strategy of, are you going through channel partners, are you going direct to consumer, how are you approaching the marketing challenge?
Sure. So at this stage in the company, we actually do all of our sales direct to consumer.
Right.
That's not necessarily the long-term growth plan. I think it's quite hard to grow a direct to consumer brand, particularly one that with a product that requires servicing. You just need a service network. So we do currently do it, partly because we are getting this manufacturing set up and we're now starting to scale it, and our demand is currently outstripping our supply. So that's an interesting problem to have. But also the reality is we are essentially a design company, and talking to customers constantly allows us to design better. So our plan is initially we're direct to consumer, but we'll bring in a lot more partners down the line. We have some of those discussions have already begun, but we haven't implemented them yet because we're just able to handle things at the minute and keep on learning, which is really, really important for us. So because of that, we do have to spend a lot of time, feet on the ground. We've got a fantastic marketing team, Crispin and Kenisha, and we do a lot of test rides. In fact, immediately after this, I'm going to do a test ride with a customer, or at least I've been instructed to get the bike back for a test ride with a customer. I mean, I've personally done well over 1,000 test rides over the last few years. And that allows us to get the feedback, but also because the product is pretty good to use, as I've said, we have a very high conversion rate once people are sitting on the bike. A lot of our marketing, and again, this is where it'll be different to a lot of Cambridge kind of B2B focused companies. It's a marketing journey, but with consumers, it's always a little bit different. So we have an awareness piece up at the front. So how do people just find out about us? And they'll use some pretty traditional channels like digital marketing. We've actually had quite a good print advertisement recently. Our demographic is a little bit older, so actually some of the traditional channels work quite well for us. So you get people aware of it, and then they'll go and think about it. So what we call the consideration phase. And in doing that, they'll be doing comparisons with other bikes online. So you have to think carefully about, how does your spec table on your website look compared to other bikes? How are you talking about the product? You're getting them to focus on the USPs and so on. Also look for reviews. So we've done a few reviews with journalists. Actually, mainly going to be pushing that next year once our production ramps up so we can meet the demand. Then once people have sort of made a decision that they're interested in the product, they usually want to ride it. So we currently do quite a lot of live events around the country, and we do test rides out of Cambridge. We do quite a lot of events in London because it's so easy to get to. It's such a big market. And again, just between sort of focusing on Cambridge and London has actually allowed us to keep up with our ability to supply. Yeah. But then beyond that, we have a number of test ride partners where we're going to be providing them bikes. And so test ride locations lined up all over the UK so people can access the product. So in terms of scaling, initially we can do that. Eventually, we'll be going through retailers and distributors, but we have a number of sort of intermediate steps that we can use on that growth journey. And we have a pretty good idea of how people flow through that journey as well, and the different contact points they need to make different decisions at different points.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned at the top of the conversation that one of the reasons for choosing Cambridge was the engineering talent. Yeah. Because there aren't huge numbers of B2C businesses in Cambridge, what's the marketing talent pool look like in Cambridge?
It's actually pretty decent. So there have been some really great organizations coming out of Cambridge on marketing. So like Joe, who runs the marketing meetup. Yeah. There are enough people with different interests. Also, a lot of young people coming up through Cambridge. If you want to hire a young marketer, if you get them early enough in their career, they haven't been sent too far down the kind of pharma marketing rabbit hole. So yeah, we worked with a lot of interesting people. Our marketing lead at the minute, Crispin, has a background. Well, he's sort of a local lad. He sort of grew up around Cambridge. So he's worked with a lot of different businesses, both in B2B and B2C. So really broad experience. I mean, Cambridge is just such a fantastic talent pool in general that you can usually find someone who's interesting. And also, a lot of people in Cambridge quite like bikes. So when it comes to working on the product, that's been pretty easy. So yeah, Crispin's he does a lot of triathlon and that kind of thing. So I think he was really interested just to work with bikes in general. Yeah. So yeah, it hasn't been too bad on the talent side. As you say, though, Cambridge is really geared towards certain industries, and it's such a unique and sort of serendipitous and fantastic startup hub. But I think in a city of this size, it's incredibly difficult to be the best at everything. And Cambridge has specialized over time. Although we haven't had trouble recruiting up till now, I'm not sure Cambridge is ever going to be a kind of, the B2C startup mecca. But yeah, that's I guess a question for how the city grows. Mm.
So we were talking just before we started recording that there's a group that you have a group of founders that meet up regularly. And it's become a topic of discussion as to which ones have appeared on the podcast and who's been nobbled next. But on a serious point, how does that actually work? How do you all find it, this ability to be able to meet up and share experiences?
Yeah, there are actually a lot of different groups in Cambridge. I think Cambridge, as I said, is pretty unique. One of the comments I get from a lot of people when they turn up in Cambridge, especially if they're looking to do anything in startups, is they turn up and they're like, there's nothing going on. But then after about a year, they're like, oh, there's everything going on. But it's all sort of hidden away. So I think you have to spend a bit of time going to events, meeting a few people. And yeah, I've been in Cambridge for about 7 years now. And I just feel like you're one or two introductions away from whoever you need to talk to in the city. And a lot of this happens in pubs and restaurants and very informal settings. So we have a couple of groups, mainly for founders that meet up. There's just sort of pub meetups and things for founders at different stages. And it's very social, so we're all friends as well. But often when we meet up, we'll have a sort of a theme that we'll be talking about. So, whether it's one of the things we talked about recently was working capital for startups and how that works, or which grants are coming up, if there's a change in the laws or the regulations, or how are people dealing with that. A lot of the WhatsApp groups are very, very active, and people will have quite esoteric questions. I mean, some of the questions you see, you're like, oh, no one's going to be able to answer that. And then someone will pipe up and be like, oh, I did that a year ago. So yeah, all sorts of things going on. And yeah, it's a great bunch, very open. As always, if you're collaborating, and especially if you're working in very different sectors, so you're not competing by any means, just the basics of how you run an early stage startup, get things going, find grants, whatever it happens to be, we're all kind of doing the same thing fundamentally. So those have been really, really useful.
Fantastic. I mean, it's been a really enjoyable conversation, and nice to swerve away from the usual kind of deep tech for a change. It's been allowed us to have some really interesting, different conversations.
Thanks so much for your time, Alex.
Very welcome.
Today's show was produced by Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and supported by our media partner, Business Weekly. The Cambridge Tech Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms and on cambridgetechpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. It'll really help others discover the show. Waterbeach is the thriving new community that offers the best of lakeside living just minutes from Cambridge. With new cycle routes that take you to the Science Park in 25 minutes, Waterbeach is the perfect place for you to call home. New 2 and 3 bedroom flats and 3 and 4 bed houses from Carla and Stonebond are available now, with show homes open every day. No need to book an appointment, just drop in and discover how you could start your story at Waterbeach. For more information, please visit waterbeachwb.co.uk or email hello@waterbeachwb.co.uk.